In this reflection, we will explore a form of resistance that rarely looks like resistance at all. Not violence, not revolt, not slogans or banners, but withdrawal. Non-violence, non-production and non-consumption as ways of living that quietly undermine systems of power. We begin in the Roman Empire, where taxation, accumulation and constant economic participation were the lifeblood of imperial rule. We then listen closely to the words of Yeshua, often read as spiritual or moral advice, but here examined as economic realism spoken into an imperial system. Along the way, we look at Mammon, not simply as money, but as a logic that demands loyalty, fear, and continual participation. We examine why Yeshua speaks of unrighteous Mammon, why he warns against storing up wealth, and why minimalism and non-consumption are not modern trends added onto the Gospels, but practices already present within them. Finally, we draw a line from that ancient world to our own, a world where accumulation still concentrates upward, where prices outrun incomes, and where more and more people quietly choose to step back, not as ideology, but as survival. What happens, we ask, when enough people do this? And why might such quiet withdrawal have been dangerous then and still be dangerous now? We conclude this reflection with a point-by-point summary of the main ideas. Let us begin. The Roman Empire was not primarily an ideological project. It was an economic system built on flow. Taxes from conquered provinces kept the army running, financed the administration, built roads and cities, and ensured that wealth and power flowed toward Rome. The empire depended on stable production, continuous labor, and predictable revenues. When this flow functioned, Rome functioned. When it faltered, unrest followed. For people living in the provinces, this meant life under constant economic pressure. Taxes came in multiple layers: Roman levies, local taxes, tolls, and indirect burdens. One bad year could be enough to lose land, fall into debt, or become permanently dependent on others. Debt was not an abstract concept, but a concrete path into loss of freedom. Economic security was fragile, and the future uncertain. But imperial power did not operate only from above, through soldiers and laws. It also worked from within. Under this pressure, people began to internalize the empire's own logic. If power accumulated, one had to accumulate as well. If security lay in storage, one had to store. If the future was uncertain, one had to secure more than enough. In this way, people were drawn into the very system that drained them of life. Accumulation became hope. Storage became virtue. Caution became morality. Fear of tomorrow became the driving force. It was not only Rome that accumulated wealth. People did the same on a smaller scale, driven by necessity and anxiety. The empire's greatest victory was not military but psychological, when its logic became people's own. It is into this landscape that Yeshua steps. His words have often been read as timeless spiritual exhortations, detached from economic and political realities. But heard in their historical context, they are anything but abstract. When he says, "Do not store up treasures on earth," he speaks directly into a society where storage appears to be the only rational response to insecurity. When he says, "You cannot serve both God and Mammon," he addresses people who feel the pressure of a system that demands ever greater loyalty. Mammon here is not merely money in a narrow sense. Mammon is a logic, a master, a way of organizing life around future security, increasing effort, and continual sacrifice. Mammon promises safety but is never satisfied. It always moves the finish line. That is why Yeshua says one cannot serve both God and Mammon, not because money itself is evil, but because Mammon demands total attention. It wants to own time, thoughts, and life choices. When Yeshua says, "Do not worry about tomorrow," this is often reduced to psychological comfort. In context, however, it is an economic and social statement. A person who organizes life around fear of the future is easy to govern. Fear binds more tightly than coercion. Anxiety makes people willing to accept almost anything, as long as it promises a measure of security. Yeshua's alternative is therefore not passivity, but a different way of living. Non-violence and non-production, understood as refusing to organize one's entire life around the empire's need for accumulation, become a strategy for preserving human dignity. Non-violence deprives power of its preferred weapon, legitimized brutality. Non-production deprives it of the nourishment it needs to grow. The Roman Empire could tolerate violent revolts. History shows this clearly. Uprisings could be crushed militarily, used as deterrents, and employed to justify harsher control. What was far more dangerous were people who refused escalation and at the same time lived in ways that made them less economically useful to the system. When enough people reduced production, consumption, and accumulation, the system became more expensive to maintain. Tax bases weakened. Control required greater effort. Legitimacy began to crack. This was not dramatic collapse, but slow erosion. And precisely for that reason, it was dangerous. In the Gospels, we also encounter the expression, the unrighteous Mammon. It is a striking phrase. Wealth is not presented as morally neutral, but as something that arises from and operates within an unjust system. Mammon is unrighteous not necessarily because every coin is stolen, but because the system that produces and concentrates wealth is built on asymmetry, debt, and loss from below. In the parable of the unjust steward, we are given a disturbing image. The steward knows that the system around him is collapsing. He knows he cannot win by playing by the rules. So he stops being loyal to the system's logic and uses its resources to release people from debt and dependency. The point is not dishonesty, but priority. When an economy is unjust, loyalty must shift from the system to people. This sheds new light on the statement, you cannot serve both God and Mammon. Mammon has already been defined as unrighteous. To serve Mammon is to accept its premises, that security always lies in more, that the future must always be secured through increased effort, and that life must be optimized accordingly. God, as Yeshua presents him, stands for something else: trust, relationship, dignity, and presence. This is not an inner moral struggle, but a real conflict of loyalties between two ways of organizing life. Here, Yeshua's teaching on minimalism and non-consumption also becomes clear. When he sends the disciples out without extra clothes, money, or provisions, this is not asceticism for its own sake. It is a practice that prevents accumulation, reduces dependency, and makes movement and freedom possible. It is anti-storage logic in a society where storage equaled security. When he says, look at the lilies of the field, this is not nature romanticism, but a critique of status and production economies. Life's value is not legitimized through productivity or consumption. Abundance loses its power to define the human being. A person's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions is a direct rejection of consumer logic, not only of greed, but of the very idea that more produces a better life. The parable of the rich fool reinforces this. The man who builds larger barns to secure his future does everything right according to economic logic. He plans, optimizes, and stores. Yet this is portrayed as meaningless. Not because planning is sinful, but because life is reduced to accumulation and future security. This collides head-on with both Roman and modern thinking. Non-production and non-consumption are therefore not escapes recognizing responsibility, but breaks with an economy that requires ever greater participation to sustain its own growth. To live more simply, to produce enough but not more, to reduce the need for income, and to refrain from excess are practices that weaken the system's grip on people's fear, time, and future choices. We now move forward in history. The Roman Empire fell. Empires rose and fell. Technology, science, and political systems transformed the world radically. Yet one structure remained remarkably stable: the concentration of wealth and the pressure on those at the bottom. Today as well, we live in societies built on accumulation and continuous growth. Today as well, we see wealth concentrating among relatively few, while more and more people experience economic insecurity, despite higher education and greater effort than previous generations. Today, too, there is a dominant narrative: invest in education, build a career, work hard now, and security will come later. This appears rational. It is our era's storage logic. Education becomes an investment object. Career becomes insurance. Life is organized around a future that always lies just ahead. The problem arises when reality does not fulfill the promise. Housing prices and living costs race ahead of incomes. Debt becomes a permanent condition. Temporariness becomes normal. For many, it becomes clear that even maximum effort no longer grants access to what was once considered basic: a home, stability, predictability. Then something happens that is also historically familiar. First, people try harder. Then they blame themselves. Finally comes the realization, this is not only about individual choices, but about structures. For most, this realization does not lead to revolt or ideological struggle, but to a personal decision. They withdraw. They work less, consume less, avoid debt, live more simply, not to protest, but to preserve control over their own lives. But when enough people do this, something more than the sum of individual choices emerges. Non-production becomes systemic. Value flows from below weaken. Accumulation slows. The system's dependence on constant participation becomes visible. Some begin to see this as a new form of class struggle, not through violence or revolution, but through absence. Through saying, we will not organize our lives around a system that constantly moves the finish line. This is quiet. It lacks slogans and leaders. Precisely for that reason, it is difficult to suppress. Systems can manage protest and criticism, but they struggle with people who no longer believe in the rewards and therefore reduce their participation. Here our time once again encounters the insight implicit in Yeshua's words. He does not proclaim an alternative empire, but an alternative way of life. A way of living that makes power less effective, because it no longer has total access to people's fear, time, and ambition. When people stop defining life's value through ownership and consumption, the system loses something fundamental. This brings us to an uncomfortable but legitimate question. Was this also a reason why Yeshua was crucified? Crucifixion was a Roman punishment for those perceived as threats to order, not only military threats but symbolic and social ones. Yeshua led no army. He did not call for revolt. But he taught people to live in ways that undermined the economic and social preconditions of imperial power. He challenged Rome not with weapons but with an alternative pattern of life. In an empire that lived by flow, control, and participation, this was not harmless. 2,000 years later, we face a similar crossroads, not in form but in structure. Will we continue to organize our lives around systems that demand ever more while offering diminishing security in return? Or will we dare to live more lightly, more freely, knowing that if enough people do so, it becomes not only a personal choice, but a force capable of reshaping society? Nonviolence and non-production were dangerous for the Roman Empire, and perhaps they are still dangerous for exactly the same reason. Let us now summarize this reflection. For the first point, the Roman Empire was sustained not only by force, but by economic flow, taxation, production, and participation. Its power depended on people continuing to work, accumulate, and organize their lives around imperial needs. For the second point, Yeshua's teachings were spoken directly into this reality. His warnings against storing up treasures, serving Mammon, and living in constant anxiety were not abstract spirituality, but a challenge to the economic logic of the empire. For the third point, Mammon is described as unrighteous because wealth, as it functioned then and now, arises within unjust systems. To serve Mammon is to accept a way of life organized around fear, accumulation, and endless optimization. For the fourth point, non-violence and non-production were not passive choices. Together they deprived the empire of both legitimacy and nourishment. When people withdrew without revolt, the system weakened slowly but persistently. For the fifth point, minimalism and non-consumption in the Gospels are not moral posturing, but practices of freedom, ways of living lightly enough that power loses its grip. For the sixth point, our own time mirrors these structures. As accumulation accelerates and security recedes, many withdraw quietly. What begins as personal choice becomes, when widespread enough, a structural challenge. And finally, this helps us understand why Yeshua may have been perceived as dangerous. Not because he led a rebellion, but because he taught people how to live without full dependence on the system that ruled them. Non-violence and non-production were dangerous for the Roman Empire, and perhaps they remain dangerous today, for exactly the same reason. Thank you for listening. If you found this reflection meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps others find these conversations. May you walk in clarity, freedom, and peace.